No one saw her cry. And perhaps that is the most devastating detail of the entire story, because when a woman stops crying, not out of strength, not out of pride, but because she has reached a place inside herself where tears simply can no longer reach, something far deeper than sadness has already happened. Eleanor Ashford stood at the center of the most magnificent ballroom in Yorkshire, dressed in sapphire blue, pearls at her throat that had once belonged to the Duke's grandmother, surrounded by 300 of the most influential people in England. The orchestra played. The crystal chandeliers scattered the light of 1,000 candles. Ladies laughed behind open fans. Lords discussed politics in dense clusters near the tall windows. And her husband, the man whose name she carried, whose title defined every aspect of her existence, was on the other side of the room, leaning toward young Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. It was the 5th time that evening. Eleanor had counted, not because she wanted to, but because the human body, after years of learning to survive pain, develops the cruel habit of cataloguing the exact moments it is forgotten. What no one around her knew, what no one would ever have imagined, watching that serene smile, that impeccable posture, that grace which appeared effortless but had been purchased at an extraordinary cost, was that something inside Eleanor Ashford had, in that precise moment, simply stopped. It did not break. It did not explode. It did not sink. It stopped. Like a clock that, after years of marking hours that mattered to no one, quietly decides it has done enough. What happened in the months that followed changed everything. Not only for her, not only for the Duke, but for every person within those grey stone walls who believed they understood what a marriage was, what dignity looked like, and what a silent woman was truly capable of doing. Because Eleanor's silence was not weakness, it was a decision, and when the Duke William Ashford finally understood what he had lost, he would discover that some absences cannot be repaired, only endured. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far the stories I write travel across the world. The Ashford Castle Winter Ball was, by local tradition, the most anticipated event on Yorkshire's aristocratic calendar. It had begun in the time of William's grandfather, the 3rd Duke of Ashford, as a modest gathering of neighbouring families, and over 50 years had grown into something that rivaled, in sheer grandeur, many events in London itself. Politicians travelled from the south. Families from the north sent their eldest sons in hopes of arranging suitable matches. Society journalists described the gowns and jewels with a precision that bordered on the poetic. It was, in every sense that mattered to that world, a spectacle. And Eleanor had learned, across 8 years as the Duchess of Ashford, that spectacles demand very well-rehearsed performers. She had arrived in the ballroom at 9 o'clock precisely, as was expected. She had greeted each guest with the carefully calibrated warmth of someone who knows exactly how much affection is appropriate for every occasion. She had admired the gowns of the ladies, asked intelligent questions about the business affairs of the lords, smiled at the younger children of families who had arrived, hoping to elevate their standing. She had done, in short, everything a duchess was supposed to do. William had done none of it. He had appeared at 9:30, which was already a small insult in itself, given that it was his castle and his ball. He had shaken a few hands near the entrance, exchanged a few words with Lord Pemberton and the Earl of Whitmore, and then, as naturally as if he were simply crossing a room to retrieve a forgotten book, had drifted toward Lady Beatrice Hawthorne and remained there. Eleanor had noticed at 10 the first time. She had been speaking with old Countess Marlowe about the restoration of a garden at the Marlowe estate when she felt that particular stillness settle over the room, the kind that only she could detect because it was invisible to everyone who wasn't paying the specific, exhausting attention she had spent years learning to pay. People were watching, not rudely, not openly, but watching all the same, in that refined aristocratic manner that disguises observation as idle glancing, as adjusting one's gloves, as turning to speak to a companion while keeping one eye precisely where it ought not to be. They were watching to see what the Duchess of Ashford would do. Eleanor had smiled at Countess Marlowe and said something gracious about climbing roses. The second time had been at 10:30. William had laughed, genuinely laughed the way Eleanor had not heard him laugh in perhaps 3 years, at something Lady Beatrice said. The sound had carried across the room with a cruelty that was entirely unintentional, which somehow made it worse. The third time, just before 11, a footman had approached Eleanor to ask whether she wished for supper to be served, and she had looked up from her conversation to find William guiding Lady Beatrice toward the east window alcove, his hand briefly at the small of her back. Eleanor had told the footman that supper could wait another quarter of an hour. The fourth and fifth times had blurred together, somewhere between 11 and midnight, and it was during the fifth that something shifted. She was standing alone for just a moment, genuinely alone in the small gap between one conversation ending and another beginning, and she looked across the room at her husband. Really looked, the way she rarely allowed herself to anymore, because looking too carefully at William Ashford had a way of reminding her of things she preferred to keep at a comfortable distance. He was a handsome man. That had never been the problem. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of angular jaw and cool grey eyes that painters loved, and women found devastating. He wore his title the way he wore his evening coat, as though it had been made specifically for him, as though the world had arranged itself around his particular dimensions. He was also, Eleanor thought with a clarity that surprised even herself, a man who had not truly seen her in years. Not since the early days, when things had been different. When there had been evenings in the library and rides across the moors in autumn, and a brief bright period, she could measure it now in months, not years, when William had looked at her the way he was currently looking at Lady Beatrice Hawthorne. She had been 22 when they married. She was 30 now, 8 years. She held her champagne glass and looked at her husband and felt, moving through her with the quiet certainty of a tide going out, something that she would only name much later, alone in a room where no one could see her face. Relief, not heartbreak, not rage, not even sadness precisely. Relief, as though something she had been bracing against for a very long time had finally, definitively, arrived, and now that it was here, she no longer had to spend her energy waiting for it. Lady Pemberton appeared at her elbow, bright and oblivious, wanting to discuss the new railway extension that was apparently threatening someone's hunting grounds, and Eleanor turned to her with a perfect smile. "How dreadful," she said, in exactly the right tone, and inside the quiet architecture of her own mind, something very small, very calm, and very final began to take shape. She did not sleep. This was not unusual. Eleanor had become over the years a light and unreliable sleeper, the kind of woman who lies very still in the dark and thinks with a precision that daylight rarely permits. The grand ducal bedroom at Ashford Castle was beautiful and cold and far too large for one person, which it had effectively been for the better part of 5 years. William kept his own rooms in the East Wing. This had begun as a practical arrangement. His late nights, her early mornings, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were two people who had found a workable distance and had calcified, the way such things do in aristocratic households, into simple fact. She lay in the grey pre-dawn light and looked at the canopy above her bed, which was embroidered with the Ashford crest in gold and ivory thread, and she thought very carefully. She thought about Rosewood Manor. It had belonged to her mother's family, the Carrington estate in Devonshire, left to Eleanor upon her mother's death 6 years ago. It was not large by the standards she now inhabited. 7 bedrooms, a modest park, a walled kitchen garden that she had been told was badly overgrown, and a small staff of 3 who had been maintaining the property in a state of dignified suspension, waiting for someone to remember it existed. Eleanor had visited once in the first year of her marriage, when her mother was still alive, and the house still smelled of lavender and beeswax, and the particular warmth of a home that is genuinely lived in. She had not returned since. William had never asked about it. This, she realized now, was information. At 6 in the morning, before any of the household staff had reason to expect her to be awake, she rose, dressed herself in a plain grey morning gown without ringing for her maid, and went to her writing desk. She wrote 3 letters. The first was to Mr. Hadley, the solicitor in Exeter who managed the Rosewood estate, asking for a full account of the property's current condition and all outstanding matters relating to its maintenance. The second was to Mrs. Parish, the housekeeper at Rosewood, whom Eleanor remembered as a stout and capable woman with very clean hands, informing her that the Duchess of Ashford intended to visit the property in the coming weeks and requesting that certain preparations be made. The third letter she did not finish. She had begun it as a kind of accounting, to herself, for herself, of all the things she had endured and adapted to and quietly absorbed over 8 years. But she got 3 sentences in and stopped, because she found that she did not need to list them. She already knew them. She had always known them. Writing them down would accomplish nothing except to make them more real, and they were already quite real enough. She sealed the first 2 letters and set them aside for the morning post. She burned the third. Breakfast at Ashford Castle was served at 8 o'clock in the formal dining room, a room of such aggressive grandeur, 30 feet of mahogany table, ancestral portraits in heavy gilt frames, windows overlooking the south lawn, that eating toast in it had always struck Eleanor as faintly absurd. William appeared at 8:30, which was itself unusual. He was typically at his desk by 7, attended to his correspondence and estate business, with the efficiency of a man who understood that ducal responsibilities did not pause for hangovers or social exhaustion, and rarely appeared in the dining room before 10. He looked, Eleanor thought, slightly tired. She looked up from her newspaper. She read the Times every morning, a habit William had once found amusing and now simply did not comment on, and met his eyes across the length of that absurd table. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He poured his coffee, standing at the sideboard, which the footman moved to assist with, and which William waved away with the small automatic impatience he applied to all such gestures. He sat. He drank. He looked out the window at the frost on the south lawn. Eleanor returned to her newspaper. There was nothing unusual in this. They had shared hundreds of breakfasts in precisely this manner, and it had long since ceased to feel like anything at all, which was perhaps its own particular variety of sadness. But this morning Eleanor noticed something different, not in him, in herself. She felt no pull, that faint, persistent, humiliating pull that she had spent years managing. The hope that he would say something, look at her properly, acknowledge in some small way that they were 2 people who had once chosen each other, was simply absent, quiet, as though it had packed its things in the night and left without a forwarding address. She found the weather report on page 4 and read about an approaching frost system from the north. "The Hawthorns have invited us to their estate in January," William said, without looking away from the window. "How kind," Eleanor said. "I told Pemberton we'd likely attend." "Of course." A pause. The fire crackled. A footman replenished the toast rack with the silent efficiency that was the hallmark of a well-run household. And Ashford Castle was, whatever else might be said of it, extremely well run. Eleanor had seen to that personally. "The ball went well," William said. It was not quite a compliment to her, and not quite an observation. It occupied the ambiguous middle territory that much of their conversation had come to inhabit. "The staff performed beautifully," Eleanor said. "I'll make sure Mrs. Henderson knows." William nodded once, finished his coffee and rose. He was at the door when Eleanor spoke again, not looking up from her paper. "I intend to visit Rosewood in the new year," she said. "I've been meaning to attend to some matters there." A brief pause. "Rosewood," he repeated, as though locating the word from a considerable distance. "My mother's property in Devonshire. I believe it requires some attention." "I see." Another pause, shorter this time. "How long do you intend to be away?" Eleanor looked up then and met his eyes and smiled, the same serene, practiced smile she had worn at the ball, and said, quite pleasantly, "I'm not entirely certain yet." William nodded again in the way of a man who has already moved on to the next item on his internal agenda, and left the room. Eleanor set down her newspaper and looked at the space where he had been standing. Not entirely certain yet. That was, she thought, entirely true. The letters came back within the week. Mr. Hadley's reply was thorough and faintly apologetic in tone, as solicitors' letters often are when delivering news about neglected properties. The roof of the west wing required attention. The kitchen garden walls needed repointing. 3 of the upper bedrooms had damp that should be seen to before winter deepened. The small greenhouse, which Eleanor had not remembered until she read the word and felt something warm move through her chest, had a broken pane. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was manageable. Mrs. Parrish's letter was shorter and warmer, and smelled faintly of something Eleanor couldn't quite identify. Wood smoke, perhaps, or dried herbs, and said, in the direct and unembroidered manner of a woman who had kept a house running for 30 years without being asked to make it sound elegant, "We will have everything ready for you, Your Grace. It will be good to have the house breathe again." Eleanor read that line 3 times. It will be good to have the house breathe again. She folded both letters and placed them in the small locked box in her writing desk, where she kept correspondence she wished to preserve. Then she sat very still for a moment and allowed herself to feel, in a controlled and private way, the faint flicker of something she was careful not to name too quickly. She had learned over the years that naming things too quickly gave them a fragility they did not need. She began, very quietly, to prepare. There were practical matters first. She reviewed the household accounts for Rosewood with Mr. Hadley's figures in mind, allocating funds for the repairs with the calm efficiency of a woman who had managed a castle's finances for 8 years and found, to her occasional dry amusement, that she was rather good at it. She wrote to a builder in Exeter whom Hadley recommended. She ordered several items: linens, a new set of kitchen equipment, curtain fabric in a pale green she had been thinking about for no particular reason, through a London supplier she trusted. She did all of this from her writing desk at Ashford Castle, between her other responsibilities, in the interstices of a life that continued exactly as before on its visible surface. William did not ask about her preparations. He was occupied with the estate, with parliamentary business that required him to be in London twice in December, with the correspondence and meetings and obligations that filled a duke's calendar like water fills a container, completely leaving no visible space. Eleanor did not mention Rosewood again, but she thought about it. She thought about the walled kitchen garden and what might still be salvageable in it. She thought about the small sitting room on the ground floor that looked east, and how it would catch the morning light. She thought about the greenhouse and whether roses could be coaxed back from a state of long neglect, whether, given sufficient attention and time, something could be restored that had been allowed to go half wild. She thought about this more than was strictly necessary for the purpose of a property visit. It was her lady's maid, Agnes, a bright, observant young woman who had been with Eleanor for 4 years and had the good sense to be perceptive without being intrusive, who first noticed the change. "You seem well this week, Your Grace," she said one morning, while dressing Eleanor's hair. It was said carefully in the manner of someone testing ice. Eleanor considered this in the mirror. "Do I? There's a—" Agnes paused, selecting her word. "A settled quality, if you'll forgive me saying." Eleanor looked at her own reflection, at the composed face, the steady eyes, the hair that Agnes's capable hands were arranging with their usual precision, and thought that settled was, in fact, quite accurate. "I've been thinking about Devonshire," she said. Agnes nodded as though this explained everything. Perhaps it did. That afternoon, Eleanor walked the length of the Ashford East Gallery, a corridor she had always found oppressive, lined as it was with 7 generations of Ashford ancestors in various states of formal grimness, and stopped at the end, where a door led to a small room that had been used at various points in the castle's history, as a schoolroom, a map room, and most recently, a storage space for items that had no other obvious home. She opened the door and looked inside. It was dusty and cluttered, and full of the particular gloom of spaces that have been closed too long. But it had 2 large windows facing south, and she could see, even through the grime on the glass, that on a clear day it would have a fine view of the park. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went to find the head housekeeper and asked pleasantly whether anyone would mind very much if she had the room cleared and cleaned. Mrs. Henderson had stared at her with an expression of such startled gratitude, as though the Duchess had offered her something she had wanted to ask for but hadn't dared, that Eleanor had felt, for just a moment, the strange and complicated texture of being seen. "Not at all, Your Grace," Mrs. Henderson had said. "Not at all. The clearing of the East Room took 2 days. Eleanor was not present for most of it. She had her own responsibilities, and she was not the kind of woman who hovered over staff while they worked, which she had always found to be both inefficient and unkind. But she checked in twice each day, and on the evening of the second day, when the windows had been cleaned and the floor swept, and the accumulated objects of 3 decades sorted into piles for disposal, storage, or further attention, she walked the room alone. It was better than she had expected. The south light was exactly as good as she had imagined. The ceiling had a plasterwork border in a simple geometric pattern that she hadn't noticed from the doorway. There were built-in shelves along one wall, good oak, a little battered but solid. That would be useful. And there, on the lowest shelf, pushed so far back into the corner that it had evidently been invisible behind whatever had been stacked in front of it, was a small wooden box. Not a decorative box, a plain practical one made of dark wood with a simple brass latch, the kind used for keeping papers or correspondence. It had no marking on the outside, except for a small oval of darker wood inlaid in the lid, a Carrington crest. Eleanor went very still. The Carrington crest, her mother's family. She lifted the box carefully. It was light. The latch opened without resistance. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cream muslin that had gone yellow at the edges, was a bundle of letters and, beneath them, thin and worn with handling, a small, leather-bound book. She stood in the bare, clean room with the box in her hands and understood, with an odd certainty, that she had found something that had not been intended to be found. She did not read anything that night. This was a discipline she had developed over years, the practice of not rushing toward things simply because they were there. She brought the box to her sitting room, set it on the small table beside the window, and went to bed. In the morning, after breakfast, in the quiet hour when the castle's daily machinery was in motion, but had not yet required anything specific of her, she sat down, untied the muslin, and began. The letters were from her mother, or rather, they were to her mother. Written, the handwriting told her immediately by her grandmother, Margaret Carrington, who had died before Eleanor was born. There were 11 of them, spanning what appeared to be a period of roughly 3 years in the 1840s. Eleanor read them slowly. They were not dramatic letters. They were not confessional or scandalous or filled with the kind of revelations that make a reader's hands tremble. They were, in many ways, simply the letters of a mother to a daughter, full of domestic detail, observations about the garden at Rosewood, comments about neighbors and weather and the price of certain goods. But woven through them, in a voice so measured it might have been overlooked by a less careful reader, was a portrait of a marriage. Her grandmother's husband, Eleanor's grandfather, a man she had known only from photographs and family anecdote as a figure of considerable authority and very little warmth, appeared in these letters as something more complicated than the family mythology had suggested. Not cruel, not dramatic, simply absent, in the way that men of his generation and class had been systematically taught to be absent from the emotional lives of their families, present in rooms, absent in ways that mattered. "He is a good man," her grandmother had written in one letter, in a line that Eleanor read and then read again. "I have never doubted that. But I have spent 20 years learning that goodness, in a man of his nature, is not the same thing as presence. I have learned to build my happiness in smaller rooms. I have my garden, I have Rosewood, I have you, my darling. It is enough. I have decided it is enough, and that decision, I think, is itself a kind of freedom." Eleanor sat with this for a long time. Then she set the letters aside and opened the small leather book. It was not a diary exactly, more a commonplace book, a record of observations, quotations, occasional sketches of plants in the margins. Her mother's handwriting this time, though younger than the version Eleanor remembered, less certain in its letter forms. She turned to the last entry that had been written. "I am bringing the letters and this book to Ashford when I go," it said. "I want Eleanor to have them one day when she is ready. She will know what they mean. She has always been more like mother than she knows." The date on the entry was 1882. 6 months before her mother had died. Eleanor closed the book. Outside the window, the Winter Park lay frost-white and still under a pale sky. A single crow crossed from the oak grove toward the kitchen garden, unhurried. She had not known her mother had ever been to Ashford without her. She had not known her mother had left anything for her to find. She sat with the box in her lap and thought about 3 women, her grandmother, her mother, herself, and the long, quiet, invisible thread that ran between them. The thread of women who had learned to build their happiness in smaller rooms, except that Eleanor, she realized, was not going to a smaller room. She was going to Rosewood. December deepened. The grounds at Ashford were magnificent in winter. The park took the frost like a formal portrait takes a good frame, and the long avenue of beeches leading from the main gate wore their bare branches with a severe beauty that Eleanor had always privately loved. She walked every morning in the hour before the household required her, wrapped in her heavy wool coat with the fur collar that had been her one concession to vanity in an otherwise practical wardrobe. She walked and thought, and what she thought about increasingly was not Ashford. The preparations for Rosewood continued quietly. The builder in Exeter had written back with a detailed assessment and a timeline that, while not rapid, was reasonable. The west wing roof would be seen to before the worst of winter. The damp in the upper rooms could be addressed in January. Mrs. Parish had apparently, on her own initiative, already begun to air the ground floor rooms and had written a separate note specifying that the kitchen garden, while badly overgrown, had several established rose beds that appeared to be still alive beneath the chaos. Eleanor wrote back about the rose beds with more detail than was strictly necessary. What she had not anticipated, what she would later recognize as the first sign that her preparations were visible, even when she believed them invisible, was the effect on the Ashford staff. It began with small things. Thomas, the second footman, who had always been perfectly adequate and never more, began appearing a full 10 minutes before his duties required him, not with the anxious efficiency of a man worried about his position, but with the quiet alertness of someone who had decided to pay attention. Eleanor noticed this on a Tuesday and said nothing. Marta, one of the kitchen maids, began leaving small posies of holly and dried rose hips at the base of the staircase that Eleanor used most often. There was nothing ostentatious about it. They simply appeared and were replaced when they faded, and no one mentioned them. Mrs. Henderson, who had been running the Ashford household with iron competence for 16 years, and who had the emotional vocabulary of someone for whom sentiment is a luxury to be indulged only in private, sought Eleanor out one afternoon on what appeared to be a routine matter about the linen inventory, and then, when the linen had been discussed to its natural conclusion, remained standing in Eleanor's sitting-room doorway with an expression that Eleanor had not previously seen on her face. "Is there anything," Mrs. Henderson said very carefully, "that your Grace requires in particular, anything that is not being attended to?" Eleanor understood the question. It was not about linen. She looked at Mrs. Henderson, at this woman who had served this house through its seasons of plenty and its longer seasons of a quieter kind of desolation, and felt the particular warmth of being asked, plainly and honestly, by someone who genuinely wanted to know. "I think things are coming along nicely," Eleanor said. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." The housekeeper nodded once with a firmness that managed to convey both professionalism and something more personal, and left. That evening at dinner, a meal Eleanor took alone more often than not in December. William being occupied in London for the week, she found that the usual 3 candles on the dining room sideboard had been supplemented by an additional 8, casting the room in a warmer and more generous light than she was accustomed to. She ate her soup and did not cry, which was not difficult, and felt the room around her as though for the first time. The East Room, her new room, she had begun to think of it this way, though she had not said it aloud, had been furnished simply. A writing table, 2 good chairs, a bookcase she had populated with volumes from the general library that she had always meant to read properly and never had, a small painting she had moved from the upstairs corridor, a landscape of the Devonshire coast that had belonged to her mother and had been hanging, unnoticed, in a space where it was seen by no one. It faced the window now. It was the right place for it. She spent 2 hours there each afternoon. Sometimes she wrote letters, notes, the beginnings of a list she was compiling about the Rosewood garden. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she simply sat with the south light on her face and felt the strange and not entirely comfortable sensation of a self being quietly reassembled. Agnes had stopped commenting on the change in her. This was, Eleanor thought, because it was no longer a change worth commenting on. It was simply how she was now. It was on a Thursday in the 3rd week of December that she heard from Lady Pemberton, who had come to call and stayed 2 hours and meant well in the inexact way of people who are curious about things they are too polite to ask directly, that William had been seen at the theatre in London with a party that included the Hawthorne family. Eleanor poured more tea. "How pleasant for them," she said. Lady Pemberton watched her with the slightly baffled expression of a woman who had expected a different response and didn't quite know what to do with the one she'd received. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it was." After Lady Pemberton left, Eleanor sat for a moment in the East Room with the afternoon light fading on the Devonshire coast painting and took careful stock of what she felt. It was something. She was not so far removed from herself as to pretend otherwise. Something tight and tired, somewhere behind her sternum. But it was no longer the specific pain of a woman waiting to be chosen. It was something older and simpler. The particular weariness of someone who has finally understood that they have been waiting for something that is not coming, and who has, at considerable cost, stopped waiting. She was leaving in January. She was certain of this now. Christmas came to Ashford Castle with the predictable grandeur of a household that could afford to celebrate it beautifully, and the particular hollowness of a household that had, over time, lost the art of celebrating it warmly. There were wreaths of pine and holly on every door. The great staircase was dressed with garlands and ribbon. The kitchen produced an abundance of extraordinary food. The estate tenants came on Christmas Eve for the annual distribution of gifts. Coal, food, small amounts of money. A tradition Eleanor had managed personally for 8 years, and which she carried out with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Moving through the estate hall with the ledger, she kept herself and the quiet, unhurried attention to each family's particular circumstances that had made the tenants, over the years, deeply and privately devoted to her. William attended for the first hour. He shook hands. He said appropriate things. He left. Eleanor stayed for 3. In the days between Christmas and the New Year, she completed her preparations. The trunks were packed, not all of them, not conspicuously, not in the way of a woman making a departure that demanded to be noticed. 3 trunks of her own things, her books, the box from the East Room, the Devonshire coast painting, carefully wrapped, the letters and the commonplace book, which she had reread twice and intended to read again. She made arrangements for the household in her absence. She met with Mrs. Henderson and went through the running of the castle with the meticulous care of a woman who takes seriously the welfare of the people who depend on her, even when she is leaving them. She wrote notes for the cook, the head gardener, the steward. She settled every outstanding household account herself. She told no one except Agnes and Mrs. Henderson that she was going, not because she was hiding. She was not hiding, she had been entirely open about Rosewood from the beginning, but because there was nothing to announce. She was visiting a property she owned. This was unremarkable. She had no interest in making it remarkable. William was due back from London on the 30th of December. Eleanor was due to depart on the 2nd of January. There was a small cold arithmetic in this, and she was aware of it, and she did not alter her timetable. He arrived home on the 30th as planned, which she noted with the mild interest of someone tracking the movements of the weather. She was in the East Room when she heard the sounds of his return, the horses, the footsteps, the particular density of sound that a person of status brings with them into a quiet house. She stayed where she was. He came to find her eventually. This was newer than it might sound. For a long period, he had simply not sought her out on his returns, in the way that familiar things are not sought because they are assumed to be there. But something in recent weeks, she could not have said exactly what, had made him slightly less certain of this assumption. He stood in the doorway of the East Room and looked at her, and then at the room itself, which he was seeing for the first time in its current state. "You've done something with this room," he said. "I have." She did not look up from her book immediately. Then she did, and met his eyes. "Did you have a good Christmas in London?" A pause. The question was entirely pleasant. It was also, she knew, and he perhaps half knew, a small and specific kind of knife. "Productive," he said. "Good." He looked at the room again. The books, the painting, the soft arrangement of a space that had been made quite deliberately into somewhere a person wanted to be. "You leave for Rosewood on the 2nd, he said. "Yes." "How long do you intend to stay?" She had asked herself this question many times in the past weeks. She had arrived gradually at an answer that was honest. "For as long as it takes," she said. William looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, and she noted it with the precision of a woman who has learned to note things exactly. Something moved in his expression, something that was not quite confusion and not quite concern, but occupied the uncertain space between them. Then it closed the way it always did. "Well," he said, "I hope the journey is comfortable." "Thank you," she said. He left. Eleanor sat in the south light of the room she had made for herself, inside a house that had never quite managed to become her home, and listened to his footsteps receding down the corridor, and thought about a sentence her grandmother had written 40 years ago to a daughter who had carried the words across a lifetime, to leave them for a granddaughter she had known would understand. That decision, I think, is itself a kind of freedom. On the 2nd of January, the carriage was brought round at 9 in the morning. Eleanor descended the main staircase in her travelling coat, with Agnes beside her and the trunks already loaded, and walked through the entrance hall of Ashford Castle with the step of a woman who has made a decision and will not be unmade by anyone's watching. William was at his desk when she passed the study. The door was half open. She could see him there, bent over his correspondence, the grey winter light falling on his dark hair, his pen moving without pause. She did not stop. She did not look back, and as the carriage wheels found the gravel and the beech avenue opened ahead of her, bare and pale, and leading toward everything that was not behind her, Eleanor Ashford sat with her hands folded in her lap, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily count, to feel the particular and extraordinary sensation of a life that belonged entirely to herself. She watched Yorkshire pass the window. She was going to Rosewood, and somewhere behind her, in a study full of correspondence that had not paused to notice her passing, a man sat at his desk and did not yet know that the room had just become, in ways he could not feel but would, before long, be unable to ignore, very much quieter than it had been before. William noticed it on the 4th day. Not immediately, not in the way of a man who pays close attention to the texture of his domestic life, because he did not, and this was the central fact of everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. He noticed it in the way that a person notices the absence of a sound they had long since stopped consciously hearing. Gradually, with a growing unease that precedes understanding by some distance. The study was the same. His correspondence was managed by his secretary with the same efficiency. The meals arrived at the correct hours. The fires were lit before he entered any room. Ashford Castle continued to function with the precise, well-oiled reliability of a household that had been trained to an exceptionally high standard. But something was different. He could not at first name it. It was on the 4th evening, a Tuesday, cold and dark by 4 in the afternoon, the park invisible beyond the black windows, that he walked past the east corridor and saw, through the half-open door at the end, the room that Eleanor had remade. The south-facing room that had been a storage space for as long as he could remember. He stopped. The fire had been banked, but not extinguished. Someone, Agnes presumably maintaining it in Eleanor's absence, had kept the room in a state of quiet readiness, as though its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and would return before long. The books on the shelves, the writing table with its orderly surface, the painting of the Devonshire coast on the wall where it caught, even now, the last pallid light from the window. William stood in the doorway and looked at this room for a long time. He had walked this corridor hundreds of times, thousands perhaps. He had never looked through this door and seen anything worth stopping for. He went inside. It was a small room by the standards of Ashford, comfortable rather than grand, the kind of room that spoke of a person rather than a position, which was, he was beginning to understand, a distinction that mattered considerably more than he had previously considered. He looked at the books: history, natural philosophy, a well-thumbed volume on garden design, 2 novels he didn't recognize, a slender book with a Carrington family crest embossed on the spine that he lifted and opened to the first page, where a name was written in his mother-in-law's handwriting. He closed it and put it back. He looked at the painting. He did not know the Devonshire coast from a painting, but he knew the feeling of a landscape that has been chosen because it means something to the person who chose it, rather than because it fills a space on a wall. He sat down in one of the chairs, Eleanor's chair he understood instinctively, the one angled toward the window, and felt, in that room which was so precisely and quietly a portrait of someone he had not been paying attention to, the first faint and unwelcome intimation that he had been missing something. Not that he had done something wrong, not yet. He was not a man who arrived quickly at self-reproach. But something was present in that room, some quality of intention, of care, of a self deliberately and thoughtfully constructed, that he was only now encountering, and the lateness of the encounter was beginning to suggest a question he didn't want to look at directly. He sat in the chair until the fire died down. Then he went back to his study, where his correspondence waited with its usual patience, and he worked until midnight, and he did not think about the room again that evening. But he did not close the door to the corridor when he passed it on his way to bed. The following morning, He asked Mrs. Henderson, with the careful casualness of a man who wishes not to appear to be asking, how long Her Grace intended to remain in Devonshire. Mrs. Henderson regarded him with an expression he could not quite read, which was unusual because he was generally good at reading people, and said evenly that Her Grace had not specified a return date. "Did she seem well when she left?" he asked. Another pause. "She seemed very well, Your Grace," Mrs. Henderson said. There was something in her tone, not insubordination, nothing so overt, but a quality of precision, as though she were choosing very well with some care, and meant it to carry more than the words alone. He thanked her and returned to his desk. He wrote 4 letters that morning. None of them were to Eleanor. By evening he was aware that this was a choice he had made, and that it was not a comfortable one to look at. Eleanor had been at Rosewood for 11 days when William's first letter arrived. She was in the kitchen garden when Agnes brought it out to her. She had taken to spending the mornings there in the cold, clear air, assessing what could be saved and what was lost beyond recovery. The rose beds her mother had written about were, as Mrs. Parish had said, alive. Brutally overgrown, sprawling in directions, roses were not meant to sprawl but alive. The canes were thick and the root systems, when she dug carefully at the edges, showed the dense, determined vitality of something that had been left alone long enough to become entirely itself. She liked them better, she thought, for having survived without anyone's help. She took off her gardening gloves and opened the letter. It was short. William's letters were always short. He was not a man for whom the written word was a natural medium of feeling, and had never pretended otherwise. It asked after her health and the condition of the property. It mentioned that Lord Pemberton had asked after her at the club. It noted that the weather in Yorkshire had been particularly cold. She read it twice. Then she went inside, sat at the small writing desk in the east-facing sitting room, which had turned out to be exactly as full of morning light as she had imagined, and wrote back. Her reply was also short. She was well. The property required work, but was coming along. She hoped the weather in Yorkshire would improve. She did not mention when she was coming home. She sealed the letter and gave it to Agnes and went back to the kitchen garden. The correspondence continued at a rhythm of roughly 1 letter per week. His grew very slightly longer, not dramatically, not in the way of a man who has had a sudden revelation and is attempting to communicate it through post. But there were small additions, a detail about the estate that she would have been informed of in person had she been present, a comment about a book he was reading. Once in the 3rd week, a single line that sat in the middle of an otherwise practical paragraph like a stone in a stream, deflecting everything around it. "The East Room remains as you left it. I have not touched anything." Eleanor read this line 3 times. She wrote back about the greenhouse, which she had begun to restore with the help of a local man named Farrow, who had worked the Rosewood grounds for 20 years and who had the careful hands and unhurried manner of someone who understands that plants operate on their own schedule and cannot be rushed. She did not comment on the East Room. What she was building at Rosewood was not dramatic. That was, she had come to understand, rather the point. The repairs proceeded. The roof of the west wing was attended to by the builder from Exeter, a taciturn man named Garrett, who did excellent work without requiring supervision or conversation, both of which Eleanor respected. The damp in the upper bedrooms responded to treatment. The greenhouse pane was replaced, and Farrow had sourced several young plants from a nursery in Taunton that were now arranged on the shelves in the careful optimism of things given a second chance. She had the drawing room repainted, a pale, warm yellow that caught the winter light, and turned it into something almost southern. She had the furniture in the library rearranged so that the best chair faced the window rather than the fireplace, which had always seemed to her a curious prioritizing of warmth over view. She planted bulbs in the kitchen garden, in rows that Farrow helped her plan with the methodical pleasure of people who enjoy planning things that will not come to fruition for months. Tulips and narcissus, and the early flowering crocus that would, if they were lucky, push through in late February. She read her grandmother's letters again, more carefully this time, and found in them new things she had missed on the first reading, small observations that resonated with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like inheritance. She found herself speaking to her mother and grandmother in the privacy of her own mind, in the way one does with the dead when something has happened that would have interested them. Mrs. Parish ran the house with a steady and undemonstrative competence that Eleanor found deeply restoring after years of the magnificent efficiency of Ashford. Not because Ashford was worse, it wasn't, but because Rosewood's competence felt like kindness rather than performance. She slept well. She woke before dawn and lay in the quiet, and did not feel the complex, exhausting vigilance that had been her companion for so many years in the castle. She ate her meals at a small table in the east sitting room and watched the light change on the Devonshire hills, which were softer than Yorkshire's moors and greener even in January, and felt the slow, strange restoration of something she had not realized was so entirely depleted. She was not happy, precisely. That seemed too simple a word for something this textured. She was, she thought, becoming herself again, or perhaps becoming herself for the first time. She wasn't entirely sure which, and had decided it didn't much matter. His fourth letter asked directly when she was coming home. She sat with this question for an entire day before answering. Then she wrote, "When the work here is finished, I shall return. There is more to be done than I initially anticipated, but I am finding the work rewarding. I hope you are well." She was aware, when she sealed the envelope, of what she was doing. She was not playing a game. She was constitutionally unsuited to games, had always found them exhausting and demeaning. But she was also not pretending to an urgency she did not feel. The truth was simple and slightly frightening. She did not miss Ashford. She missed certain people there, Agnes, who was with her, Mrs. Henderson with her carefully chosen words, the kitchen maid's small posies of holly, the tenants she had visited at Christmas. She did not miss the castle itself. She did not miss the long evenings at the mahogany table in the light of too few candles. She did not miss the east wing's separate darkness. She did not miss counting the times she was not seen. She did not miss her husband, and this, more than the relief she had felt at the ball, more than the calm of the early mornings, more than anything else in this quiet, restorative month, was the thing she most needed to sit with, not because it meant she did not care, but because it meant she had cared for a very long time, with a ferocity and a one-sidedness that had left her seriously depleted, and that the depletion was now, in this house full of morning light and overgrown roses, beginning to fill. And the thing that was filling it was not William. It was herself. William arrived at Rosewood on a Wednesday afternoon in the last week of January, without prior notice. Eleanor was in the greenhouse when she heard the carriage. She had dirt on her gloves, and a cutting of something Farrow had called a climbing Bourbon rose in her hands, and she stood for a moment in the thin afternoon light coming through the new glass pane, and registered the sound with a steadiness that surprised her. Then she set down the cutting, removed her gloves, and walked out to meet him. He was standing in the front courtyard when she emerged from the side of the house, not where he had expected her to appear. She could tell by the slight adjustment of his bearing when he saw her come from that direction. He was in his travelling coat, still dusty from the road, and he was looking at the house. She followed his gaze. It did look different from when she'd arrived. The front facade had been cleaned. Garrett's men had done it as part of the roof work, and the windows had all been replaced and washed, so that the house caught the pale afternoon light with a transparency it had clearly not had in some time. The box hedges on either side of the front path had been clipped. There were snowdrops in the narrow beds along the foundation wall. "You've been busy," he said. There was a great deal to do. She did not ask why he had come without writing. It did not seem important. "Are you hungry? Mrs. Parish will have something." He was, and she brought him inside. He moved through the house with the slightly careful attention of someone who is trying to assess a situation without appearing to assess it, a quality Eleanor recognized because she had spent years doing the same thing in different rooms with different stakes. He looked at the yellow drawing room. He paused in the library doorway long enough to see the rearranged furniture, the fire, the books on the table with their markers and annotations. He said nothing about any of it, but he looked. At supper, taken in the east sitting room, because the dining room had not been fully prepared, and Eleanor had not thought to ask Mrs. Parish to change this. He was quieter than usual. This was somewhat relative, because William's usual mode was not loquacious, but there was a quality to his silence this evening that was different from the silence she knew. More listening, less concluded. "The tenants," he said at some point during the meal. "Have you met any of them?" "Several. There are 5 tenant families on the home farm. Farrow, who manages the grounds, has introduced me. They're good people. Are the farms in order? They'll need attention in the spring, but nothing that can't be addressed. He nodded, looked at his plate. Then, you know the estate's finances. I reviewed the accounts when I arrived. Mr. Hadley had been conservative but not strategic. There are some adjustments I've discussed with him. A pause. You've discussed the estate finances with the solicitor? Yes, she met his eyes. Was that not appropriate? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she genuinely could not read, which was unusual because she had, over 8 years, become very good at reading William. Then he said quietly, "No, it was entirely appropriate." There was something in the way he said it, not simply agreement, something more like the tone of a person making a notation about themselves. She poured more tea and moved on. He stayed for 3 days. She gave him the best bedroom, and did not alter her own routine on his account, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had done in the entire marriage, not out of deliberate provocation, but because she had, in 4 weeks at Rosewood, built a life here that ran on its own logic, and she found she could not and did not want to simply suspend it because he had arrived. She was in the kitchen garden at 7 each morning. She had her meetings with Farrow, her letters with Hadley, her afternoons with the greenhouse or the library or the rose beds, depending on the light and the weather and what needed attention. She had her evenings in the east sitting room with a book and the fire, and a quiet that felt, unlike so many other silences she had inhabited, entirely voluntary. William, she observed, did not know what to do with himself. At Ashford, he had a schedule of such density and structure that idleness was never a consideration. Here, in this small and purposeful house where everything ran to Eleanor's timetable rather than his, he found himself in the unfamiliar position of a man with time and no obvious way to fill it. He walked the grounds with Farrow on the second morning. She watched them from the greenhouse. 2 figures moving along the edge of the kitchen garden, Farrow pointing at things, William listening with what appeared to be genuine attention. Farrow was not a man who adjusted himself for rank. He spoke the same way to everyone, which was directly and at reasonable length, and William, to his credit, appeared to find this refreshing rather than offensive. In the afternoon of the second day, he came to find her in the rose beds, where she was doing the slow and methodical work of clearing the accumulated growth of several years from around the root systems. He stood at the edge of the bed and watched for a moment. "Farrow says you're out here every morning," he said. "Most mornings. He also says you know what you're doing." She looked up. "Farrow is generous." "He's not, actually," William said. "He told me quite plainly that most people who inherit old gardens don't have the patience to learn what's already there before they start ripping it out. He said you'd been out here with him for 3 weeks before you touched anything." Eleanor looked back at the rose cane in her hands. "There didn't seem to be any point in changing things I didn't understand yet." A long pause. "No," William said, in a tone she had not heard from him before. "I suppose not." He left on a Thursday morning, as the frost was still on the grass and the early light was coming in low and gold from the east. He was in his travelling coat again, and his secretary had arrived from Yorkshire the previous evening, with enough correspondence to make it clear that the Duchy could not manage his absence for much longer. He stood by the carriage and looked at the house one more time, in the way he had looked at it when he arrived, with the careful attention of someone encountering something they had not expected and are not sure they have fully understood. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was standing in the courtyard in her wool coat, her dark hair uncurled from the night and only simply pinned, her face clear and unhurried in the morning light. She did not look like the Duchess of Ashford. She looked, he thought, and this was a thought he could not have accounted for and did not pursue immediately, like someone who lived in this house, who belonged here, who had made themselves, in the space of 4 weeks, as natural a part of this place as the snowdrops by the wall. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes?" He opened his mouth. Something moved across his face, the same almost thing she had seen in the doorway of the East Room at Ashford, that quality of a word nearly spoken and then swallowed. "I hope the roses come back as you intend," he said. She smiled at him. Not the ballroom smile, something smaller and realer and, he would later think, considerably more unsettling. "They will," she said. He got into the carriage, and as it turned down the drive, she watched it until it was gone, and stood for a moment in the quiet courtyard and registered, with a precision that she had spent months sharpening, that the quality of his looking, in these 3 days, had been entirely different from anything she had known in 8 years of marriage. He had been for 3 days paying attention. She was not sure what to do with this. She turned back toward the house and the morning's work, and decided not to do anything with it at all. Not yet. It was Agnes who found the letter, not William's letter. She had those, in their orderly sequence on the desk. A different letter, the kind that does not arrive by the morning post but is delivered quietly and without fanfare by a solicitor's clerk who drives down from London on a grey February morning and asks to speak with Her Grace on a matter of some importance. Mr. Hadley was not the solicitor who came. It was a younger man from a London firm whose name Eleanor did not recognize and whose manner had the careful gravity of someone who has been given a difficult assignment and is determined to carry it out correctly. He brought papers. Eleanor sat in the east sitting room and read them in the morning light, and understood as she read that what she was looking at was not a surprise, not in its substance, not really, but that knowing a thing in the abstract and seeing it laid out in legal language, with dates and signatures and the cold precision of documented fact, were two very different experiences. The papers concerned Rosewood Manor, or rather, they concerned an attempt, undertaken 3 years ago, she saw from the dates 2 years before her mother's death, and entirely without Eleanor's knowledge, to transfer Rosewood from the Carrington Family Trust into the Ashford estate holdings. The attempt had not succeeded. A provision in her grandmother's original settlement, written in the 1840s by a solicitor who had apparently anticipated precisely this kind of maneuver, had prevented it. Rosewood was Eleanor's, unambiguously and irrevocably, held in trust and then by direct inheritance, and no subsequent agreement could alter this without her specific consent. Consent that had never been sought, because she had not been told that it had been attempted. She read the papers twice. Then she asked the young solicitor several precise questions, which he answered with the careful honesty of a man who is not responsible for what has happened, but is responsible for communicating it clearly. She thanked him. She offered him tea, which he declined. She showed him out. Then she went back to the east sitting room and sat down and did not move for a considerable time. She had, over the years, constructed various understandings of her marriage. She had understood it to be cold. She had understood it to be lonely. She had understood with the unsentimental clarity of a woman who looks at things clearly that William had married her for practical reasons, the Carrington wealth, the social connections, the fact that she was young and composed and would not embarrass him, and that affection, which had never been promised, had also never truly materialized. She had made peace with this, or something in the neighborhood of peace. What she had not understood, what these papers were now telling her with their dates and signatures, was that at some point, 3 years ago, someone had decided that what she brought to the marriage should, if possible, be absorbed entirely into what he owned. That Rosewood, the one thing that was entirely and only hers, her mother's, her grandmother's, the property that 3 women had understood as something more than an asset, had been, quietly and without discussion, the subject of a legal attempt that would have made it simply another part of the Ashford holdings. She thought about her grandmother's letter. "I have learned to build my happiness in smaller rooms." She thought about her mother's commonplace book. "I want Eleanor to have them one day when she is ready." She thought about those 2 women and the long thread of female knowledge and survival that ran between them, and felt something move through her that was larger than anger and more complicated than grief. She was not certain what William had known about this. The papers showed it had been managed through an Ashford estate solicitor, which meant someone in his household had authorized it. Whether that someone was William himself or an overzealous estate manager acting without specific instruction, she could not yet determine. She needed to know, and the quality of what she needed to know would determine what happened next. Not just at Rosewood, not just in her own quietly reorganizing life, but in everything. She wrote to William that evening. Not the kind of letter she had been writing, brief, domestic, measured. A different kind, precise and without accusation, but entirely clear about what she had received and what she required to know. She asked only one question. "Did you know?" She sealed it and sent it by the morning express. His reply arrived 2 days later. She opened it standing at the desk in the east sitting room, with the morning light behind her and her hands very steady. He had known, Not immediately, not when it was initiated. The attempt had been made by his estate solicitor, acting on a directive from William's father's old legal instructions, which had been in operation before William fully assumed management of the estate. When William had discovered it, 18 months after it began, he had terminated it. He had been told the matter was resolved. He had not told Eleanor because, and here the letter had a quality of a man writing words he knows are inadequate and is writing them anyway, he had not wanted to distress her with something that had already been rectified. She read this twice. She did not doubt that it was true. She had learned over 8 years to know when William was lying, and the texture of this letter was not that. It was the texture of something worse. A man who had made a decision about what his wife needed to know, and had been wrong in a way that was not malicious, but was deeply, specifically telling about how he had understood her. He had not wanted to distress her. He had not considered that she might want to know, that she had a right to know, that the decision of what to do with the information was hers to make, not his to spare her from. She set the letter down. She thought about the ballroom, the 5th time, the smile she had worn, the decision she had made. She thought about her grandmother's words, her mother's book, the legal papers, the roses she had been carefully tending in the cold earth of the kitchen garden. She thought about what it meant to be a woman in this world, this specific world, these specific years, these specific marble floors and mahogany tables, and names that were not yours, but that you wore because there was no other option. And what it cost, and what it asked of you, and what it left when you stopped paying. She went to the kitchen garden. She worked for 2 hours in the cold, kneeling in the dirt, her hands in the earth, and felt the particular steadiness of doing something real with her body while her mind found its footing. When she came back inside, she knew what she was going to do, not in anger, not in retaliation, but with the clear and unhurried purpose of a woman who understands now, completely and without sentimentality, what her life is and what she is building and what she will not surrender. She was going to write back to William, and she was going to tell him the truth. The letter she sent was not long. It said, with the precision she had always been capable of, but had too rarely allowed herself, that she understood the circumstances and believed him about what he had and had not known, that she was not writing in anger, that she wished to discuss the matter in person, because there were things she needed to say that letters could not carry adequately, and things she suspected he needed to hear. She asked him to come to Rosewood in the 2nd week of February. She also said, and this was the line she had written last after everything else, having considered and discarded several versions before arriving at its simplicity, that she thought it was time they understood each other properly, that 8 years of well-managed distance had served certain purposes and failed others, and that she was no longer willing to continue on current terms. She did not say, I am leaving you. She did not say, everything must change. She did not issue ultimatums, because she had never found them to be honest instruments. They performed decisiveness while avoiding the harder work of clarity. She simply said what was true. He arrived on the 10th of February. There was also, by pure accident of timing, a different difficulty waiting. 2 days before William arrived, Eleanor had received word from the Rosewood tenant farmers, through Farrow, who had come to her with the careful expression of a man delivering unwelcome information to someone he has come to respect, that there was a problem. A solicitor's notice had been posted regarding the access road that connected Rosewood's home farm to the Market Road, the road the tenants had used for 60 years. A neighbouring estate, recently sold to a London businessman named Alderton, who had no connection to the area and no interest in its customs, had decided that the road crossed a portion of his land and had therefore the right to block it. If the road was blocked, the home farm would be effectively unworkable. 3 families would lose their livelihoods. The farm itself, which was beginning, under Eleanor's attention, to show genuine promise, would be damaged in ways that would take years to recover from. She had spent the 2 days before William arrived going through every document in the Rosewood archive, a substantial collection of papers in the library that she had already partially organized, looking for the original easement agreement that Farrow was certain must exist but could not locate. She had not found it yet when William arrived. He came in the late morning, and she met him in the entrance hall with the papers spread on the library table and the particular focused energy of a woman in the middle of a problem she is determined to solve. "Sit down," she said, without the usual social lubricant. I need to show you something. He sat. She explained the situation with the access road, the notice, Alderton, the tenants, what was at stake. She showed him what she had found so far and what she was still missing. She was precise and clear, and entirely without drama, because the problem was real and required real attention, and there was no time for anything else. William listened. This was, she noticed, a different kind of listening than she had observed from him before. Not polite, not patient in the way of someone waiting for a speaker to finish. Actually listening, his eyes on the documents, his mind moving, asking the right questions at the right moments. "Have you contacted Hadley?" he said. "Yes. He's searching his own records, but the original agreement may predate his firm's involvement. When was the manor last sold before your mother's family acquired it?" 1798. The easement agreement would have been registered in the county records. If it exists, it's in Exeter. He paused. "I can have my London solicitor contact the county registry today." She looked at him. "You don't need to involve yourself." He looked back at her, something in his eyes that she still couldn't quite name. "It's your property. These are your tenants. Of course I need to involve myself." A pause. "If you want me to." There was a great deal in that last sentence, quietly said. "Yes," she said. "I want you to." The next 4 days were the most honest they had spent together in 8 years of marriage. They worked, genuinely worked, side by side, on a problem that required both of them and could not be solved by either alone. William had resources she did not, connections in London's legal world, a network of county contacts built over years of parliamentary work, the particular authority of a dukedom that opened doors which remained closed to a duchess acting independently. Eleanor had what the situation actually needed: the detailed knowledge of Rosewood, the relationships with the tenants and with Farrow, the weeks of archival work that meant she knew where to look and what to look for, and the methodical patience to sit with the documents for hours until they yielded what was needed. On the 3rd day she found it. Not in the library archive. In the small locked box that had come from the East Room, in the bundle of papers beneath her grandmother's letters, which she had reviewed but not fully examined. A single folded document, written in a legal hand from 1831, establishing the right-of-way across the Alderton parcel in perpetuity, and signed by both parties, and witnessed by 2 local magistrates. She brought it to William in the library, where he was working through correspondence with his secretary. He read it. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, not in any of their years together, and said quietly, "Eleanor," just her name. Said the way a person says a name when they are not addressing someone but recognizing them. "I found it in my grandmother's papers," she said. He nodded slowly. "I'll have Greenfield send this to the county registry today. Alderton's solicitor will have no ground left to stand on." He paused. "You've had these papers since you arrived?" "I found them in early December. I hadn't reviewed them all." "How long had they been in that room?" "Since before I was born, I think. My mother left them for me." He was quiet for a moment. "She knew you'd need them." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I think she did." The tenant's road was secure within the week. On the last evening of his stay, they sat in the east sitting room after supper, the fire low and the house quiet around them. This had happened by degrees over the 4 days, the movement from the formal register of their usual interaction towards something less practiced. Not comfortable, exactly. Too much honest weight for that, but real, in a way that very little between them had been real for a very long time. William was looking at the painting of the Devonshire coast. He had looked at it several times over the past days, not the studied assessment of a man looking at art, but the slightly unfocused look of someone who is using an object as an anchor, while their mind is somewhere more difficult. "I want to explain something," he said. "Not the opening of a performance, the opening of a genuine and costly effort." She waited. "When I stopped the Rosewood transfer, 18 months after it began, I told myself it had been an administrative error, that my father's solicitors had been overzealous and I had corrected it, and that was sufficient." He paused. "That was not honest." Eleanor was still. "The instruction was in place because my father had put it there, years before his death, and I had known it was there and I had not removed it when I took over the estate because And this is the part I have been avoiding for some time. It had not seemed necessary to remove it. Rosewood was an asset. Your assets were Ashford's assets. This was simply how things were arranged. He stopped. She could see the effort this was taking, not the effort of a man fabricating something, but of a man dismantling a position he had held for so long it had become invisible to him. I did not think about what Rosewood was to you, he said. I had not, until I stood in this house and watched you in that kitchen garden and talked with Farrow and read the letters you'd sent and saw how you'd understood this place and what it required. I had not thought about what you were capable of. What you had been doing all this time in a house that did not give you room to do any of it. She said nothing. The ball, he said. In December, the 5th time. She looked at him. Mrs. Henderson told me. He paused. Not in detail, not disloyally, but she told me enough that I understood what I had been doing. Another pause, and in it the particular quality of a man who is not accustomed to using words like these and is using them anyway. What I had been doing for years. William, I am not asking you to forgive me immediately, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I understand that there has been, that you made a decision in that ballroom that was, given what I had given you, the only reasonable decision available. He stopped, looked at the painting again. I would ask only that you believe that I understand it now, not as an abstraction, not as something I've been told, but as something I have spent the last 6 weeks since you left, actually coming to understand. The fire shifted. A log settled. Eleanor looked at her husband across the room. This man she had married at 22, with whom she had spent 8 years in a proximity that had never quite become closeness, and who was sitting now in her east-facing sitting room in the house that belonged to her family and her history and her own self, and was telling her the truth. She did not feel triumph. She had never wanted him humbled. She had wanted, if she was honest with the pure and patient part of herself that had been growing these last weeks, something more complicated than that. She had wanted to be known, really known, as a person with a mind and a history and a capacity for things he had never stopped long enough to see. And he was seeing it. Not completely. Not without the long work ahead of them, if there was going to be anything ahead of them. But he was seeing it. I know, she said quietly. He looked at her. I know you understand it now, she said. I can hear it. A pause. The question is what comes after the understanding. Yes, he said. That's the question. I'm not leaving Rosewood, she said. Not permanently, but this house is mine, and it matters to me, and I intend to spend significant time here. The tenants need attention. The garden needs attention. There are things here I am building, William, and they are real to me. I know, he said. And Ashford, she paused, choosing. Ashford is a magnificent house and an important estate, and it matters to the people who depend on it. I care about those people. I always have. But I am not willing to disappear into it again. I would not want you to. There was something in how he said it, without qualification, without the slight reservation that had always underlain his statements about what she did or didn't do. That felt new. Then we will have to learn something new, she said. Yes, he said. And they sat with the fire between them in the house that she had remade, and looked at each other with the clear and undefended attention that neither of them had quite managed before, and did not pretend that it was simple, or resolved, or anything other than a beginning. It was enough for one evening to be a beginning. By the following spring, Rosewood Manor had become something the surrounding county spoke of with a quiet and particular kind of admiration. Not because of its grandeur. It was still modest by the standards of the great houses, still a property you might pass on the road and appreciate without necessarily stopping. But because of what it felt like when you came through the gate and walked up the path between the box hedges, and were met at the door by Mrs. Parrish, who had developed, over 6 months, the particular satisfied air of a woman whose work is being seen for what it is. The kitchen garden was extraordinary. Farrow had said in his direct and unembroidered way that he had never seen anything grow quite so willingly as it had grown that season, and that he attributed this to the fact that the soil had been given what it needed and then left to do its own work. The roses that Eleanor had cleared and pruned through the cold months of January and February had come back with the specific ferocity of things that have been underestimated, tall and arching, and covered in blooms through May and June, deep pink and white, and the particular dark red of old varieties that have been growing in one place long enough to know exactly what they are. She walked the garden every morning, still, even on the weeks when William was at Rosewood, which had become, by autumn, more frequent than either of them had initially anticipated, and which had become, gradually and without announcement, something other than visits. He had learned to walk with her without filling the silence. This had taken some time. William was not by nature a man comfortable with unoccupied silence, but he was, Eleanor had discovered, a man capable of learning things when he understood what they required. He walked beside her now in the early mornings, and looked at what she showed him and asked questions she could tell were genuine, and she told him what she knew, which was considerable, and they talked, really talked, about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the whole vast middle territory between them, in a way that had not been available to them inside the stone grandeur of Ashford. Ashford had changed too, or rather, Eleanor had understood when she returned in late spring for the first extended stay since January that it had not so much changed as been permitted to become more fully itself. Mrs. Henderson had, in Eleanor's absence, done things that she had clearly been wanting to do for years, but had not felt authorized to attempt. Small adjustments to the arrangement of rooms, a repainting of the upstairs corridor in a lighter color, the addition of flowers from the kitchen garden to the main hall that made the entrance feel, for the first time in Eleanor's experience, genuinely welcoming rather than impressive. Eleanor had stood in the hall on her return and looked at the flowers and felt something that took her a moment to identify. Home, or the beginning of it. The possibility of it. She had gone to find Mrs. Henderson and thanked her, specifically and warmly, and Mrs. Henderson had received this with the precise composure of a woman who had been waiting for some time for someone to notice. The Hawthorns were not mentioned. This was not avoidance. Eleanor was not, as she had never been, a woman who avoided things, but she had understood over the months that followed the February at Rosewood that the story of Lady Beatrice and William was not, in the end, the story she was living. It was a symptom of something that had existed long before Lady Beatrice and had been, at its root, simpler and sadder than any specific drama. Two people who had never learned to see each other, and had therefore both been living in a state of invisible loneliness, within a marriage that looked from the outside entirely adequate. What was harder to look at, and what she had looked at, in the long, clear mornings of a Devonshire spring, was the degree to which she had participated in this, not as the wronged party, because she had been wronged genuinely, but as a person who had made herself so reliably, flawlessly adequate that she had left him no particular reason to look more carefully. She had managed everything so completely that she had made herself, in some sense, invisible. She was no longer invisible. This was not something she had accomplished through any single act, not through the departure itself, though that had been necessary, not through the found document or the letters or the restored garden. It was the accumulation of all of them, the slow, methodical, entirely unglamorous work of becoming visible to herself first, and allowing everything else to follow from that. In the autumn there was a dinner at Rosewood. Not large, 12 people, neighbours and a few friends from London, a local family with several grown children, and a warm and cheerful manner that Eleanor had found restorative. The dining room, which had been refurbished over the summer in a deep cream that caught candlelight beautifully, held the table and the people easily, and Mrs. Parish had collaborated with the cook on a menu that was genuinely excellent without being effortful, which is the finest kind. William sat at the other end of the table and talked with the man beside him about agricultural reform, with the particular animation he reserved for topics he genuinely cared about, and Eleanor, watching him from across the room, thought, I had forgotten that he does that, that he has that. She thought about what it meant to rediscover a person, not to discover someone new, but to see the person who was always there with different eyes, the eyes of someone who has stopped waiting for them to become what she needed, and is looking instead at what they actually are. It was not entirely comfortable. It was, she thought, considerably more interesting than comfortable. After the guests left and the house was quiet, they sat in the east sitting room in the habit they had developed, the fire low, the night outside the window very still, the conversation unhurried. They liked you, he said. They were easy to like. Eleanor, He said her name the way he had said it in February in the library when she had brought him the document, with that quality of recognition. "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "Are you happy?" She considered this seriously, as he deserved. Not the automatic answer, "Quite well, thank you," but the real one, the one that required looking at her own life clearly and honestly. "I am better than I have been in a very long time," she said. "I am not unhappy." A pause. "And I believe that I'm moving towards something I would call happy. It's slower work than I expected." He nodded. "For me as well." "Good," she said. It was not everything. It was the truth. And the truth, she had learned, in her grandmother's letters, in the cleared room, in the January kitchen garden, in the long and necessary months of becoming herself, was always, in the end, enough to begin with. Outside, the Devonshire hills lay in their autumn dark. The kitchen garden was settling into its winter rest, having given everything it had, resting now in the faith that it would be tended again in the spring. Inside, the fire burned low. Two people sat in a room that belonged entirely to one of them, and spoke honestly to each other, and did not pretend the work was finished. The roses would need attention in February. She was looking forward to it.